Welcome everyone. Here we are at the first session for this morning on the 13th of May at the Gender Justice in Disaster Conference Inspiring Action, and it is an awesome day here in autumn in Australia. And it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Bob Pease, this morning. Pardon me. I'm Teresa Capetola. I'm an educator at Deakin University, and Bob and I have been colleagues over many decades, so it's lovely that we're both here this morning. Bob will be presenting his keynote looking at gendering global warming and environmental violence, so a topic I'm certainly personally very interested in, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet. I know that we are all separated and we're all in our own places, but I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I am today, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands in which we all join this morning. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. You are very welcome. So Bob is currently the Adjunct Professor of Social Change at the University of Tasmania and an Honorary Professor in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Deakin University. Now, he's been involved in pro-feminist politics with men for many years, and he was a founding member of Men Against Sexual Assault in Melbourne, and he continues to be involved in community education and campaigns against men's violence against women. He's published extensively on masculinity politics and critical social work practice, including 5 books as a single author and 15 books as a co-author, as well as numerous book chapters and journal articles. Bob was an inaugural member of the Gender and Disaster Task Force, led by the GADPOD and chaired by the then Emergency Management Commissioner, Greg Lapsley, and Women's Health Goulburn North East CEO, Susie Reid. So Bob, I'm going to hand over to you. We've got about half an hour and then we're going to open up to questions. Our audience will see that we are taking questions in the Q&A bubbles, so we're not taking questions on the chat, and you can vote for any of the questions that you see on the Q&A. So we should have about 10 minutes following your presentation. So my absolute pleasure to welcome you here today. Thank you, Bob.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Teresa, and hello everyone. It's I was saying earlier, it feels a bit weird in these days of Zoom, not being able to see your collective faces and get a bit of a sense of the connection. So still adjusting to this process. I'd like to say a few things by way of introduction as well. Before I start the slide presentation. I want to start by acknowledging that the feminist work that's been done on this issue of gendering global warming, much of which I draw upon here. The issues of a gendered perspective go back to very much to the 1970s with the eco-feminist debates, and so much of what I'm saying in the first part of this presentation is not particularly new. However, in the current contemporary debates about global warming and climate change, we don't see that gendered perspective in part of the broader public discussion. And there's even less acknowledgement of what this gendered perspective actually means for men and men's involvement in either their involvement in environmental activism or their neglect of the issues. And so the second part of the presentation is I want to really focus on what a gendered perspective on global warming means for men. And because that seems to me to be something that's even less on the agenda. And in this part of the presentation, I'm perhaps going to be a little bit theoretical and perhaps even utopian in talking about this, because I'm under no illusions that the most privileged group of men, and that's the men in the capitalist class, white straight men in the capitalist class in Western countries, are going to be responsive to the kinds of arguments that I'm going to advance here. I'm under no illusions that that this kind of argument is necessarily going to kind of create a resonance, and all of a sudden privileged men are going to transform themselves and change their relationship to the environment and their insight into global warming. Sadly, I don't think that's going to happen. But at the same time, I think we need to have some kind of notion about what sort of transformation is required if we're going to be able to move forward. And I don't think that kind of transformation that's required is about changing to a different kind of masculinity. Most of the ways we currently engage men, whether it's in terms of issues of environmental activism, or it's about violence against women, or campaigns for greater gender equality, most of the ways we engage men are about suggesting that men need to develop a different kind of masculinity, whether it's a healthy masculinity, a positive masculinity, an alternative masculinity, a democratic or a caring or an ecological masculinity. I could keep going on and on about the different types of masculinity that are seen as an alternative to the sort of toxic masculinity that we see as the heart of the problem. I'm going to suggest that this is not what we need to do, that in fact we need to move beyond these. When I see all of these masculinities as what I call anthropocentric, I think we have to move beyond these anthropocentric masculinities to bring about the kind of changes that we need. So that's by way of introduction. So let me see if I can get the technical things happening and come to the first slide. Okay. Great. Okay, that sounds good for a start. Okay, so the first thing to acknowledge is that, and when we talk about this, is to recognise that the impact of climate change and global warming is differentially felt. We know this is in terms of geographical location, issues of gender, race, class, sexuality, and disability. So we're looking here at a problem that impacts on some groups of people much more than on others. And most of the research that's been done, when we kind of bring this kind of perspective, focuses on these vulnerable populations. But we tend not to look at the gendered power and the patriarchal discourses that actually shape climate change, and the way in which they frame climate change predominantly as a scientific problem, a technical problem that bears no relationship to gender, patriarchy, capitalism, and or colonialism. So that I think that when we frame climate change primarily as a scientific and technical problem, we ignore the social and political dimensions of the problem, because it's the social and political dimensions of the problem that I think we need to engage with. I mean, we hear the importance about listening to the science, and yes, it's important that we listen to the science. But we need to understand why we're not listening to the science. What are the obstacles? What are the restrictions? What are the things that get in the way of us listening to the science and then acting on what the scientific indications are that we need to do? So there's been very little research into the kind of systemic privilege that is at the heart of the human causes of global warming. And so it's this aspect that I really want to focus on today in the first part of the presentation. And I think to do this, I think we need to talk about what we now call the Anthropocene, and what comes from that is the notion of anthropocentrism, which basically means that human beings perceive themselves as separate from nature because of their rationality. It's the sense of being separate from nature, and it's this kind of separation that leads us as humans to be conquerors, to to see ourselves as separate from the environment and in charge of the environment, and leads to our, I believe it leads to our destruction of the environment. But there is a problem, I think, with this notion of the Anthropocene and anthropocentrism, because the language of anthro implies all humans, that all of us as humans are shaping the issues facing the planet. And I think that this ignores the differential contribution of particular groups of humans. It seems to me that it's the human interests that are connected to colonialism and capitalism and patriarchy that we need to be acknowledging. I mean, we often hear in the context of the coronavirus, the dictum that we're all in this together. And this is a dictum we hear in relation to climate change too. We're all in this together. And of course, there's a level at which this is true. We are all in this together, but we're not all in it in the same way. And I think that we need to kind of acknowledge that those sorts of differences and those social divisions. And what this means, I think, is that we need to have feminist and decolonial engagements with the Anthropocene. We need to look at the ways in which patriarchy and colonialism shape and contribute to environmental destruction. Because it seems to me that it is the masculine and colonial dimensions of anthropocentrism that are central to human supremacy and male entitlement. And what I want to focus on more today in the presentation is the masculine dimensions of anthropocentrism. So I want to look at the connections between hegemonic masculinity and the kinds of responses we make to climate change. And part of this, I think, is the framing of climate change as primarily a technical or a scientific problem, because I think this, once I mean, of course, it is, there is a level at which it is a technical and scientific problem, but it's not only a technical and a scientific problem. It's a political and a social problem as well. And we need to understand the political and social dimensions of it. And so I'm interested in the way in which the framing of the problem has become masculinized. And I talk about the masculinization of environmental politics. And we see this in many ways. It's predominantly men who are responsible for the major organisations that are addressing climate change. And we see even when we look at the IPCC reports that very much it's the technical aspects of the problem of climate change that are discussed, and the social and political dimensions and the values and the politics are not part of that discussion. And we see this in terms of geoengineering projects, technological fixes, that the attempts to find some sort of technological fix that's going to be able to address the problem. And even the notion of environmental management, even the discourse and the disciplinary field of environmental management, that tells us something, because it's the whole notion about managing the environment. The environment is something to be managed. And so I think we see a kind of a gender dimension in the language and the framing of the whole issue of climate change and global warming. At the same time, I think we need to see this gender dimension intersectionally. That when we talk about masculinity, it's intersected with race, ethnicity, class, and other social divisions, as well as the political divisions of the North and South. And I think it's useful to acknowledge that environmental activism has been dominated predominantly by Western, white, middle-class men. And it hasn't always been inclusive of women or of working class people or people of colour or Indigenous people. So that the movement itself of environmental activism has reflected certain forms of privileged positioning. And I think that we've tended to focus on the social vulnerabilities of climate change, and I understand why we do that. We look at that differential contribution. We need to understand these social vulnerabilities and how some people are more vulnerable to climate change than others. But we also then need, seems to me, to look at the other side of that, which are the privileged groups who are predominantly responsible for reproducing climate change. I mean, in other work that I've done, I've been interested in how we tend to focus on disadvantage and the oppressed side at the expense of looking at the other side of oppression and disadvantage, which is privilege. And how do we challenge and unpack and deconstruct and reconstruct and understand the role that privileged groups play in reproducing inequalities. And because I think the reality is that those that contribute most to climate change and global warming, these are the people who are less likely to take action to address it. And so how do we understand that resistance? How do we deal with that? How do we kind of, in campaigns and climate change activism, how do we kind of get those privileged groups to be more responsive? And what are the issues that are getting in the way of that kind of responsiveness? And I think that hegemonic masculinity also plays a part even in environmental activism itself. We have what's called a kind of eco-modernism, which promises some form of reconciliation between ecological and industrial modern discourses. That somehow or other we can get we can find the balance. You know, that there's no fundamental contradiction between sort of unbridled economic growth and environmental protection of the environment. That somehow or other there's no fundamental contradiction here, and it's simply a matter of getting the balance right. And so the eco-modernism promises to sort of find this balance, to continue forms of economic growth, but to do so in ways that cause less harm to the environment. And I see this as a form of kind of eco-modern masculinity. And that environmentalists who are pushing for more radical structural change are dismissed. They're vilified. It seems to me that hegemonic masculinity, dominant forms of masculinity, are a significant reason for men's lack of concern about the environment. Back now, it must be about 30 years ago, Raewyn Connell interviewed a number of men who are involved in environmental activism to explore the link between their environmental activism and their masculinity. She was looking at the issue of how did the masculinity of male environmental activists shift and change as a result of their environmental activism. And at the time, she was hopeful that as men became involved in more environmental activist movements and developed environmental consciousness, there would be a shift in their masculinity, and that we would start to see a greater degree of pro-feminism among men and a greater degree of environmental concern. In the 30 years since that piece was published, sadly, we haven't seen a significant change in either the level of environmental activism by men or a move towards greater pro-feminism. But there certainly does seem to be a link between the support that men have for gender equality and environmental consciousness. So how do we kind of foster that link, and how do we understand and try to promote that link? I think it's interesting here when we even look at something like the contribution that meat eating contributes to environmental problems. There's what I call a kind of meat as masculinity discourse. And by that, I mean that for many, many men, the eating of meat itself is a way of affirming their masculinity. I mean, we know statistically that the majority of vegans and vegetarians are women. And even men who become vegan or vegetarian have a need to somehow still affirm their masculinity. In fact, in contrast to the kind of thing we often hear that real men eat meat, I've heard some male vegans developing a counter discourse along the lines of real men are vegans. And so the notion is somehow or other, if we can encourage men to think of themselves as reproducing their masculinity by becoming vegan or vegetarian, that's the way to go. And I think we see this more generally with environmental politics. I can remember a discussion took place a few years ago in the Greens, where there was a view that one of the problems about the limited number of men getting involved in the Greens is that it's seen as somehow environmental concern is seen as too feminine. And so the strategy proposed was that somehow or other we have to make green politics more masculine. We have to sort of make concern and care for the environment as something that's consistent with masculinity, to engage and have more men involved. And it always struck me as a problem, because if masculinity and dominant forms of masculinity are a source of many of the problems to do with the environment, trying to masculinize environmental consciousness and environmental action to engage men seems to me as not the most fruitful way to go. But that might be something people want to raise some questions about later on. So I'm interested in how we rethink the relationship between men, masculinity and nature. And in many ways, in the field that I've worked in for a number of years, the kind of what's called the critical scholarship of critical masculinities, that there's been very little work on exploring men's relationship with nature. And I find this, to me, it seems to me this is a really interesting gap in the sort of last 25, 30 years where this as a disciplinary field has developed. And there's been a lot of work done on looking at the relationship between masculinity and violence against women and a whole range of issues, but we haven't really, not much work has been done on exploring this issue. There have been some more essentialist writings in the mythopoetic men's movement of the 80s and the 90s and the work of Robert Bly. There was a move to sort of try to find some redeeming features in traditional masculinity and encouraging men to commune with nature and seeing hunting and wild man rituals as being more in connection with nature. So there was that more essentialist kind of link. But it seems to me that even in more recent times that we hear a language about eco-masculinities being talked about and ecological masculinism. I don't think they provide a way forward because of their essentialist premises and because of their lack of acknowledgement of structural inequalities between men and women and their lack of engagement with patriarchy and colonialism as systems and sources of oppression. But one of the things I think we need to do is I think that we need to break with what I see as an essentialist premise, and maybe this will be contentious, that women are somehow necessarily closer to nature than men. You know, and some of the elements of ecofeminism in the 1970s fostered this view that only women will be able to change the world because women are more connected to nature and men are somehow more connected to culture. And it's that sort of essentialist connection that women have to nature that leads women to be more environmentally concerned, more active politically. I think that lets men off the hook, and I want to kind of really challenge whether or not it's necessarily so that women are closer to nature than men. So I'm interested in how we change men's relationship with nature. And it seems to me that there are links between the kinds and forms of masculinity that contribute to men's violence against women and other men, and the masculinity that contributes to global warming. It seems to me that the campaign against men's violence, more generally, men's violence against women and men's violence against boys and other men, is the same kind of masculinity that's contributing to global warming and climate change. And I think these struggles and campaigns need to be linked. In fact, I would go so far as to say global warming itself is a form of gendered structural violence, that it's a form of environmental violence because it's violence against ecosystems, and the violence against ecosystems contributes also to the violence against humans. And so I think it's useful to start talk about global warming as gendered structural violence. Or there's a book published recently by Rob Nixon on what he calls slow violence. He talks about global warming as a form of slow violence. And like other forms of structural violence, this is something that you can't easily see because the way that it kind of impacts on the environment. So I'm interested in this question about how we change men's dominator relationship to the natural world. And for me, this means we need to develop what I call a critical ethic of care among men. Now, I don't think and this is an issue that people might want to ask some questions about. I don't think it's a question about developing more caring masculinities or more environmental masculinities or more positive and healthy masculinities, because it seems to me that if masculinity is the heart of the problem, simply transforming and changing the masculinity is not going to address the issue. And masculinity is always exalted above femininity. I can't imagine a form of masculinity that won't be privileged in relation to femininity. It's that kind of dualism, I think, that is at the heart of the problem. And so I think we have to develop this critical ethic of care among men, but not a new kind of masculinity. And this means we need to find more vulnerable ways of men being in the world. And that means we need to move beyond masculine anthropocentrism. We have to rethink the importance of rationality, autonomy, and the intentionality of the human subject. It's the white, male, Western bourgeois concept of the human man that gets presented as humanity. So we have to challenge this notion of what I call sovereign men regarding themselves as invulnerable, because of that sense of invulnerability that men have, that I think creates this sense of national mastery, and that overrides all moral concerns, all concerns about the environment, all concerns about the impact that has not only on the planet, but on other human beings as well. And so for me, this means we have to challenge dualism. And I think Val Plumwood, going back as far as 1993, really identified this as the heart of the problem then. And she talked about the way that dualism shaped the ways we understand the world, whether it's talking about Western or non-Western, man or woman, or human or animal, or culture and nature. It frames the way we understand the world, and that these dualisms are always hierarchical. That, and this is why I make the argument that we can't really construct a form of democratic, positive, healthy masculinity, because it'll always be hierarchical in relation to femininity. And rather, we have to challenge and change and address the dualisms. We have to then think about our gendered subjectivities in non-dualistic and non-hierarchical terms. And part of this, Val Plumwood was arguing, so many years ago, was it's this denial of dependency among men and this myth of autonomy that leads men to dominate women, non-human animals and nature. And so I think it's worth returning to Val Plumwood's work of so many years ago, because I think that it has really important insights into the kind of issues we're facing at the moment. And so for me, this means the project has to be one of how we move from encouraging men to foster a sense of vulnerability. The whole notion of masculinity is to encourage men to be competent, strong, independent, successful. This fosters this sense of invulnerability. And I would argue that invulnerability is a form of ignorance, that it's an illusion, and that it's this experience of invulnerability that I think encourages violence against others on the planet. It's this sense of, because also this experience of invulnerability blocks our capacity as men to acknowledge the vulnerability of others. Our own experience of invulnerability doesn't enable us to see the impact of our actions in the world and how they impact on others and on the planet. To be vulnerable then is to acknowledge our relational connections to others and to the planet. So what I argue is that this means we need to develop embodied, affective and entangled subjectivities. As men, we need to become more embodied, because it's our embodiment which exposes us to injury and harm. And I think, those of us men who are aging become much more conscious and aware of this as we age. We become more conscious of our mortality, our vulnerability. And it's so much more harder with younger men whose physicality in the world, where they perceive themselves as invulnerable and unable to be injured or harmed. I think we have to somehow encourage a greater connection among younger men about the significance and importance of embodiment. We also have to develop what I call an affective sensibility. We have to be emotionally open to our experience of others in the world, because I think that it's only when we allow ourselves to be emotionally open that we express that we're able to experience some form of grief and loss and sorrow. It's only when we feel some sense of emotional distress about what's happening to our planet that we're going to be encouraged to take some sort of action against it. So we have to explore our entanglements with nature and with the wider world around us. So this means we have to develop what I call entangled empathy. We have to not only develop emotional solidarity with other humans and we have to include an emotional engagement with the non-human world. We have to experience what I call ecological vulnerability through recognizing our reliance upon the ecology of the planet. And this means we have to develop an ethical relationship with a wider community of others, including non-humans and the environment. Now, I'll just stop the slides there for a moment. So what I'm really saying here is that we really have to find a way to encourage men to develop this greater emotional sensibility, this sense of embodiment, this connection to nature. And this means transforming our subjectivity, transforming the way we perceive ourselves in the world. And as I said at the beginning of this presentation, I'm not particularly optimistic that the most privileged group of men are going to be open to this kind of sensibility. But I think that's what's required if we're going to be able to move forward. But while an Italian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, some years ago talked about what he called as pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will. And while I guess I'm pessimistic intellectually, I still hold a sense of hopefulness and optimism that we will be able to create the kinds of shifts that are necessary. And I think that if the kind of climate activism that has to come from below and the kind of movement for changes that are occurring around the world with the school strikes and the wider social movements, if these movements are going to be successful, they've got to be able to somehow shift and impact on those privileged groups of men. So I'm not sure how the timing's going, but I think I'll stop there. I think that's on time. I don't think I've gone over, so I think I'll leave. So I'll stop there. So
thank you so much, Bob. Yes, you absolutely are spot on time. It's 11:05, so we've got about 8 minutes for questions, and we've got a couple of questions I wouldn't mind posing to you, if that's okay with you, Bob. So one of the questions, and it's been upscaled as well, is from one of our attendees who has said that she's aware of men who are left-leaning, they're vegan, they're environmentally aware, but because of their privileged social position, they view their contribution to social justice through the lens of an individual rationality. So her question is, how do we bring those men towards a more radical feminist politics without creating resistance? And her sub-question is, especially when the language that we use is very abstract and academic.
Yeah. And I think that's right. I mean, I think it's interesting that when men do become vegans, they often become vegans through a kind of rational argument. They come to veganism through their mind and their heads. That it's whereas I think that when women become vegans, they do so much more out of emotional connection and concern about non-human animals and the environment. And again, I think it's partly because, and I think this is it. But it goes back to what I was saying before. I think it is that somehow or other, vegan men still somehow need to believe that they're still real men. They haven't really broken and destabilized and been happy to loosen their connections to masculinity. They might say, well, look, yes, I'm a vegan, but I'm still they might not use the language of real man, but they don't want to be somehow feminized or seen as somehow not a real man or not being masculism. So they need to continue to create a notion that their veganism and their environmental activism doesn't in somehow unsettle their masculinity. Look, how do we create that shift? I think that in the kind of workshops that I've been involved in the past, and outside of my academic work and writing, I've been involved in various workshops around engaging men in violence prevention work. And one of the things I know is in those workshops that if I'm going to get any kind of shift in men, it's not just going to be through an illumination of a new insight about, oh, okay, I didn't realize it was quite like that. I need to create an environment where men allow themselves to be emotionally moved and distressed by what is actually happening to women and children and the planet and to other humans. And so pedagogically, I can talk about processes and strategies I've used in a workshop format about how I create the kind of conditions experientially to create a sense of emotional connection. I mean, I know that when I'm doing a workshop with men, I know that I'm getting through to men when they start crying. I mean, when they start feeling emotionally moved and distressed, I know that I've reached them in some way. Because until we actually feel that sense of distress, then about what we're doing to the planet and other humans, I don't see any shift. And if we approach our environmental activism and the veganism through a rational mode and a need to hold on to a particular kind of masculinity, I don't think that we're going to create that shift.
Yes, it certainly is a challenge, isn't it? And it's kind of like a transformative way of becoming, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, we've got quite a few questions, and I'm just looking at the time as well. I'm just going to have a quick look at, well, one of the questions, and this occurred to me as well, is how do we straddle the tension between needing to engage in consciousness raising with boys and men, and not to overburden ourselves, so obviously women, with emotional labour?
Look, I think that this is why I think in many ways that more men need to be engaged and active in working and changing other men, rather than relying upon women to create that change. That I think that, yes, I mean, I think women have invested a lot of themselves emotionally in trying to change men, whether it's changing men in their individual partnerships and relationships with men in intimate connections, or it's changing men in violence prevention programs. And I know myself, even as a man, I mean, every time I run a workshop with men, it knocks me out emotionally for the next couple of days. I mean, I'm just totally exhausted and drained by it. And I've got incredible respect for the women who put themselves into these, where they're continuing to do this work. I think that more of us as men have got to come forward to take greater responsibility for doing this work with other men. And so that women, it doesn't rely and fall upon women solely to have to change us as men. We as other men have got to be doing this work. And I know well from my own involvement what an emotional toll it takes. And until more of us as men are doing it, women, it's going to be left to women. So I think it's our responsibility as men to acknowledge our complicity. And this is why I think we need to really resist this notion of not all men, because I think this idea of not all men, it's just that small group of men over there, and those of us other men who are not physically violent, who are not actively destroying the environment, somehow not complicit or part of the problem. We have to acknowledge our complicity, our contribution to the problem, and we have to take moral responsibility to address that as men.
Yes, I totally agree. We're coming up to our time, and I just wanted to mention another question. I don't know if you've got a minute to perhaps ponder on this question, and it's a question about how there is a reluctance for men to prevent disasters, and the person who's posed this question has said that Victor Stephenson, the Aboriginal activist and researcher, talks about caring for country as opposed to fighting fires. Yeah. So is this emblematic of Western masculinity?
I think that we have so much to learn from Indigenous culture, and the kind of connection to nature and to the planet that I'm arguing for, and I can cite Western white academic sources to make this argument, but I think that parallel to this has been Indigenous people's relationship to land, to country, to nature, and I think we have so much to learn from Indigenous people, and I think we have to find that kind of connection to land and to country that Indigenous people know so well, and you know, there's a much of the kind of intellectual engagement I have with some of these issues written by white Western men, and sometimes there's no recognition and acknowledgement that Indigenous people have been connected to land and nature and the planet for so many thousands of years, and that we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We need to listen and be responsive to to what we can learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters.
Now that's a wonderful segue into our next segment. So we do have quite a few questions, and we've also got some lovely acknowledgements in the Q&A section, Bob. So lots of thanks from our attendees, lots of thanks from me. This session is recorded, so it will be available for others to have a look. There might be a way in which you could perhaps try and respond to some of these other questions, which just has opened up a wonderful dialogue here. Yes. We do need to move on because of time into our next section, and our next session will be a panel discussion, and we will be looking at climate activism. We'll be talking to a group of women mainly. We'll be looking at some young women involved in school strikes, and we'll be also looking at a national campaign from the Climate and Health Alliance and also from the Environmental Institute and University of Sydney. So I'm looking forward to that session, and I'll be chairing that panel in the next few minutes. So formally, Bob, thank you so much. You've raised lots of questions. We have challenging work ahead of us. I really appreciated how you were able to link in the issues on climate change with some of our other more pressing issues around violence against women, and the win-win that can occur from action at all of those levels. So thanks very much, Bob.
Great. Thanks, Teresa.